Hey guys, how you going? This is BillyEatWorld again. Thanks for stopping by. And just remember, if you like what you see, don't forget to hit that like button. Also, feel free to take a look at some of my other videos if you like. You can find them all in playlists in the description down below. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about tactical shooters, which have had a bit of a resurgence lately with the release of Rainbow Six Siege and Squad. In fact, for the last few years, there's hardly been any decent tactical shooters come out, so it's a big deal that two were released in the same month. And this comes in the wake of big budget games like Battlefront and Hardline being criticised for being too casual. So is the tide of FPS gaming turning? Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see, but it seems like a good excuse anyway to take a look at my favourite games in this genre. Now, before we start, what is a tactical shooter? Well, pretty much like the name says, it's a shooter that requires tactics. I mean, for example, in a game like COD, you can survive with good reflexes alone, but in a tactical shooter, you really need to use your brain. The reason for this is because usually the games have a hardcore damage model, realistic weapon mechanics, or a combination of both. And that means that each individual player is a lot weaker, so you really need to think smart and use teamwork if you want to compensate. One thing you're going to notice about all the games on this list is that they're all very different, which is part of what makes this genre so appealing. Each game makes you think in different ways, so unlike an arcade shooter, a tactical shooter is most likely going to give you a much more dynamic experience. Also, I should mention that all of the games on this list are relatively recent, but just bear in mind that this isn't by any means a complete list of all the great games out there. So if you've got a different top 5 of new or retro tactical shooters, then feel free to let me know in the comments because I'd love to hear from you. But anyway, to kick off, coming in at number 5 is Operation Flashpoint, which is the oldest game on this list, but probably the best for new players. And the reason for this is because it's got all the key features you'd expect to find in a tactical shooter, but it's not too complicated to get into. It also helps that the maps are large but still fairly linear, and the gameplay is only really a notch above the realism of shooters like BF4. So all in all, it's just a good entry-level tactical shooter, and the only reason it's not higher on this list is the fact that it doesn't have a PvP multiplayer mode. So coming in next at number 4, Rainbow Six Siege is the smallest and the least realistic game on this list, but still requires just as much strategy. And that's because this game focuses on small teams and CQB maps, and with no respawns you really need to work with your team to survive. In a lot of ways, Siege is similar to competitive shooters like CSGO, and the weapon mechanics are forgiving, meaning it's still accessible to the majority of the community. But the only problem with this game is that with the small maps and the lack of modes, the gameplay can get repetitive, especially if you're playing alone. Now, coming in next at number 3 is ARMA 3, which for a long time has been the king of military sims and is by far the most realistic game on this list. The problem with this though is that it's so realistic and so complicated that it makes it less accessible, which isn't a good thing for casual players. Once you've finally got it mastered though, between the campaign and the multiplayer, it's deep enough to last you for hundreds of hours. And even when you've got through all of the base content, there's still a ton of mods you can try out, which gives the game almost infinite replayability. So coming in next at number 2 is Insurgency, which like I've said in previous videos, is kind of like a smaller, more tactical version of BF4 Hardcore. I mean, the map design is completely different, but a lot of its game modes are very similar, which means BF4 fans should be able to jump right in. Compared to most of the games on this list, the gameplay is very fast, but the weapons are surprisingly hard to handle, and the damage model is unforgiving. And that's what makes it a true tactical shooter, because you just can't run and gun like you can in BF4, and you need to think smart if you want to survive. Now, before we get on to the number 1 slot, I should give an honourable mention to Project Reality, which many would argue is one of the best tactical shooters of all time. The only reason it's not on my list though is because it released back in 2005, and to be completely honest, I never really played it until now. Also, a lot of people would argue that Red Orchestra 2 should make the top 5, but as you can see, it's a World War II game. And for that reason, as good as it is, I wouldn't really want to compare it to the modern games on this list, because it's a completely different style of game. But finally, coming in at number 1 is Squad, which is basically a combination of the super realism of ARMA 3 and the set-piece battles of BF4. What it doesn't have though is a complicated inventory system and a confusing control setup, which makes it much easier for new players to learn. Like Siege, Squad also has a focus on communication and team play, which is just as important on the much larger maps. But the best thing, in my opinion, is the massive 100 player cap and 9-man squads, which gives you that same epic BF4 feel on a much larger scale. But anyway, guys, that just about wraps up this list. So let me know what your top 5 is in the comment section below, and as always, if you like what you see, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out the links in the description below if you want to see any of my other videos, or if you want to support my channel on Patreon. And until next time, see you later, and have a good one.